values from many parts of the world. And it's that idea, that criticism, that I want to discuss today. Why does it matter? Well, it matters for many people because of this conjuncture between American hegemonic power and, if you like, the hegemonic production of knowledge about international relations. It matters because international relations, I think, has a special place in the social sciences. International relations is about how the world fits together. It's about big stories about how the world fits together. And if you can tell those stories, if they're your stories about the world, that is important for politics. That is important for power. That is important for how we think about order and justice. The ontologies of the system, the narratives about where the system is going. If you dominate those narratives, those ontologies, that is an important part of politics. And it's important for another reason, which again, I think, differentiates international relations from other social sciences. One of the features of globalization, we often think of globalization as being antithetical against ideas of sovereignty. It's challenging states, it's challenging sovereignty. But one of the most important features, historically, of globalization was the globalization of states and the state system and international society. There is, for the first time in human history, a single global political system whose architecture, whose vocabulary is the one that was inherited from the expansion of the Western, originally European order. There is no outside, politically, that institutional structure. And what that does is to bring the question of the relationship between that institutional order on the one hand and national, cultural, civilizational, religious traditions on the other into sharp convergence. One has to think about what that relationship looks like, how we think about it, how we understand it. So, let's say there is a problem. There are certainly critics saying there's a problem. It's an important subject for the reasons I've just given. What do we do? Where do we look? Well, one place to look is to look to exactly those writers who have argued over the past 10, 20, but maybe especially 5 or 10 years, that we need to have an international relations that looks at the world from a different place, particularly from the global south. This is a literature which includes many critical voices within Western international relations, includes a great deal of post-colonial literature. It includes, increasingly, voices from the emerging world that say we need to have a Brazilian school of international relations, a Chinese school of international relations. We need to see international relations from below, and we need to see international relations from the perspective of these new emerging countries. Now, and for these people, of course, the existing subject is inadequate to understand their realities. It is an elitist, exclusionary academic system, very hard to get alternative views published, very hard to get alternative views accepted within the Western mainstream. Now, this way of thinking has, I think, told us many, many really important things. It's challenged a number of the dominant ways in which North American, transatlantic international relations has wanted to see the world. Lots more than I can discuss here. So let me just throw out a few examples just to illustrate. Historically, we've seen a whole wave of writing which has challenged the account of the rise of the West. It has stressed the role of China, the role of the Islamic world in the rise of the West. What Jack Goody, the Cambridge anthropologist, calls the theft of history, the way that the West stole many of the things, many of the ideas on which its rise depended. Post-colonial writing, critical writing, has told us a great deal about how the world is constructed in ways that reflect the perspectives of particular countries and particular regions. The idea of regions, the idea that the world is divided into particular regions, Africa, South America, Asia, these, of course, are constructs. They're not natural. They're not given by geography. And many of the dominant ones arose, some of them in the period of British imperialism, most of them in the period of American empire. It was the United States that drew the maps that defined regions. It was the United States that created, through the Cold War, area studies, Latin American studies, African studies, that shaped the discipline. Critical post-colonial writing tells us a great deal about how the power to name other people, other actors, is tremendously important. The power to name rogues, name failed states, describe a conflict in terms of warlords. The capacity to use that language shapes the way in which those phenomena are understood. What post-colonial writers talk about is the epistemic violence of Western categories in constituting the others that are then analysed. And it's worth remembering, of course, that the Third World was a northern construct. And it's worth remembering that the BRICS are a northern construct. For some people, of course, they continue this idea that the dominant categories of analysis continue to be those that are created elsewhere. This wave of writing has told us lots of other things. It's looked at ideas of security. So look, security, as studied in traditional international relations, wars, big powers, tanks and battles, that doesn't tell us anything about what security means for most human beings in most parts of the world. The obsession of international relations with states, the Weberian state. Well, the Weberian state doesn't look like the most obvious central thing to be thinking about when you're studying the international relations of the Great Lakes in Africa. Many other examples of this kind, showing how the concepts, the language, the vocabulary seems to be out of sync, out of kilter with the realities we're trying to understand. Others in this same vein have told us more recently, for example, well, yes, you Northerners, you liberals, you go on about global norms, but what happens when those global norms come home and they become local? We need to understand not who presses, who pushes the global norms. We need to understand how those global norms are received and understood in different parts of the world. And maybe lastly, as an example, there's a claim, it's tremendously difficult to sustain, to push forward, to make successful, that says, well, many of these apparent changes in international relations are claimed to reflect particular parts of the world, but actually they reflect other parts of the world. Think of something like the responsibility to protect. Why is this seen as a northern Western liberal idea? Think of the influence of Francis Dane, of Ali Mazrui, in the development of those ideas. It's there most prominently in the Charter of the African Union. Why then does the West see this as its property rather than as part of a bigger conversation? Why can't the North hear what is being said in different parts of the world? So, a whole body of writing that challenges, that is constantly pressing orthodox, mainstream international relations to think about what the world looks like from different places. The problem, it seems to me, with a lot of that literature, for all that it has done very important things along the lines I suggested, is that it's often itself wedded, connected to a very static view of power. It's obsessed with the power of the West, with neoliberal hegemony. It's locked into a world where that remains the dominant focus of attention. And so the question then is, if the world is changing, if power is shifting, is that kind of what one might call oppositional form of international relations, of political science or social science, really the right one? Now, some people say, well, the world might be changing, but the dominant thing is how we understand the world, and there, knowledge production doesn't change very much, therefore nothing really has changed, therefore, as I say, we carry on doing those sorts of exercises, that sort of analysis. Well, it's true in some ways, but that seems to me to be an excessively sort of Foucauldian way of looking at the world. Knowledge production may not be changing that fast, may still be dominated by Western hegemony, but power is shifting. And so, at a minimum, we need to think about the relationship of shifting power on the one hand to the production of knowledge on another. So it's not really an adequate answer. A second reason why just continuing in that kind of critical, anti-Western type way of thinking isn't adequate is because one of the standard criticisms of the post-colonial literature is again that it's focused on the legacies of the colonial world, and it's always downplayed what we would now call South-South connections, whether in terms of power politics, whether in terms of other interactions. A third reason why something doesn't seem right just continuing with that idea of, well, we need a view of international relations from the global south that does some of the things I said, is that much of what we see when we look at emerging powers, when we look at the rise of the BRICS, seems to fit a rather traditional view of international relations. Now, it may be that the Weberian state doesn't tell us very much about conflict in the Great Lakes of Africa, but the foreign policy of big emerging states does seem, at least at first glance, to be rather familiar. And so if I have a traditional Western understanding of international relations, I can say, well, I can understand that, I've seen it before.